the wall is straight, and he says to Amos, do you see this plumb line? Well, I'm holding this plumb line against Israel, and it's not a good picture. And I want to tell you that as Israel did, so do we have a choice to make. God's standard is the one we need to go by. God's standard is actually always the right way. And I know when you say the word standards, some people instantly impose something there that hasn't always been God's standards. And I realize that. That's one of the faults of the church. That's one of the shortcomings of the church is sometimes we would get off on a standard that wasn't necessarily God's standard. And then if you ever change, then you got to explain why you changed. And it made it really hard. And so I'm not talking about man's standards. I'm talking about God's standards. Then you have a real simple question. What makes God's standard more correct than anything else? 2,700-year-old book. Not this one. This is a reprint. 2,700 years ago, Amos wrote his book. And there are people today who say, that is nothing but a dusty old book of mythology. It's made up. There is not a God. And if there was a God, He wouldn't want to be like you. And so we're left with a choice. You see, God's not going to cram His plumb line down our throat. He just sets it before us, as He did Israel. He's telling us that we have a standard to keep. The question is also the problem. God does have standards for us. And when we say no to the standards, we're saying no to God. I just preached not too long ago on the rejection of God last Sunday morning. I read that verse in Samuel where they said, give us a king. And Samuel said, I don't want to give you a king. Kings mess up. And God says, oh, give them a king. That's what they want. That's their choice. Give them what they want. They're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. See, that's the problem, is the fact that we have the ability to choose makes us choose the wrong way. Hebrews 6:13 through 15 gives us kind of the epitome of the standard. And some people don't like this either, but can we get that one up there? I'm not going to turn to all these. For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessings I will bless you, and multiplyings I will multiply you. And so after he patiently endured, he obtained the promise. That's speaking of Abraham. But the standard of God was they're going to have a covenant. And God looks around and He says, there's nothing here that I can use as collateral. There's nothing here that I can present. He made everything. He said to Abraham, count the stars, you'll have that many children. But those very things He created, God looked at that and said, this isn't enough. This isn't enough collateral to back up my side of the covenant. The greatest thing that I can say is, thus saith the Lord. He swore by Himself. And I'm going to tell you today, the reason that we can go by the standard of God is because there's nothing greater than the standard of God. That's the reason. And you can say that circular reasoning if you want to, but you have nothing else to put against God to say this is equal, this is just as good. There is nothing that lines up against God next to God's plumb line that's going to stand. So if we decide today, because saying, well, no, it's optional. I'm telling you it's optional only to the degree that God allows it so that you choose. But there isn't multiple choice. There's two choices, God or wrong. Not Chapman or wrong, not Nazarene or wrong, God or wrong. That's the only two choices because God's always right. Now, the nation of Israel was failing, and He's come to visit with them. So let's look at point number 2. Why would God pass by it all? Now, that's a question that we have to address. In fact, I put in my notes, it's a really good question. And I'm glad I asked the question so that we can get the answer out on the table, because, see, sometimes I think we preach, and in our minds we have questions. So I'm guessing in your minds you may have questions, but if we don't answer those questions, you leave saying, well, I understood what he was saying, but I had a question that he didn't answer. And if he doesn't answer this question, the rest of it doesn't make as much sense. And I thought about that. And here is my question. Is God being inconsistent when he passed by at other times and now decides he's going to bring judgment on Israel? Isn't that a good question? How come, if God is going to be just and judge and bring condemnation and bring destruction on this country, how come for the years that he didn't do it and those people had to live like that, why isn't God being a little unfair here? I'm going to say not at all. God spoke through the prophets over and over, giving warning to each generation. God was in fact being merciful in trying to get Israel to wake up. God cannot be faulted for having shown kindness that was rejected. Does that make sense to you? We can't say God didn't do right. God was doing right. It was Israel that wasn't doing right. God sent them prophets all along the way. God said, wake up. What do you think? I'm going to look at this forever? And see, in our minds, the reason we ask that question is we want to justify in our lives and say, God is not just if he judges me harshly when in fact he's let me slide so many times. We call that cheapening grace. You understand what I mean? Cheapening grace. Because God in his grace and mercy allows us to make our own decisions, then we say now God's obligated to always be gracious to me. I would tell you I wouldn't bank on that one too much. On the part of Israel, there were times that there were no prophets or judges. The kings were wicked and many people worshiped other gods, but not everyone. You see, the fact that there's always a righteous person is all God needs to say, how can you justify yourself? Now, we're not comparing the goodness of one man over another. I'm saying faithful to God. 1 Kings 19, we're just going to read 14 and 18. So we're not going to read the verses in between. Very familiar story. This is Elijah. Elijah has just had the great Mount Carmel experience. They'd just slain the prophets of Baal, and he prayed for rain, and I love that story. God said, pray for its 3-year drought. 3 years, no rain. He says, pray for rain, there'll be rain. He says to his servant, go look at the Mediterranean. See what Mount Carmel, if you've ever been there, you can actually see the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee from Mount Carmel. Very interesting place. He says, look toward the sea, see what you see. He comes back, he says, there ain't a cloud in sight. So he prayed again, Lord, you have said the drought would end. We have elevated God in this place and destroyed Baal. Let there be rain. He looks at the servant and says, go look again. 7 times. And the servant comes back and he says, I see a cloud. It looks like a man's hand on the horizon. He says, go look one more time. He comes back, he says, whoo, whoo. The western sky's black. He says, send a little message to Ahab and tell him if he's going to eat supper at his house, he might want to leave now. His chariot might get stuck in the mud. You know that story? How can you go from that victorious place? We call that a mountaintop experience now. That's a mountaintop experience. How can you go from there to getting a note from the queen that says, by this time tomorrow, you're going to be as dead as my prophets are today? And he ran away, ran all the way to Mount Sinai and hid in a cave, hoping they wouldn't come that far to get him. And he said this to God, lamenting his situation. God, I tried so hard.